Graduates, it's quite shocking to me after 12, 13, 14 years of education. If I asked them why you might write an essay, they would say, well, to get credit for the class. Well, that's sad, really, if that's the best explanation you can come up with after sitting in school for like 14 years. Man, that's dreadful. And I spent some time explaining to my students often why they should write. Now, obviously, if you're in a class, you should write because you're in class and you need to do the assignments, but that's not a good reason to write. And you write because you want to think something through. One thing about writing is that you can ask yourself a question, hopefully an important question, and one that you want the answer to. And you have to start there, because if it's not an important question, then why bother answering it? And if you don't want the answer, then why bother asking the question? And people often stumble when they're writing, or when they're thinking, or when they're speaking, or when they're interacting with others, because they get those two things wrong right off the bat. It's not an honest question. It's not about something they care about. And the answer isn't an attempt to find an answer. It's an attempt to look like you're finding an answer, or come up with a rationale for an answer that you've already assumed is going to be the case. And neither of those are interesting, and they're not helpful. And you write so that you can address something that's important to you, that announces itself as important, and so that you can think it through, and so that when you act it out, and because you act out ideas, you look at the world through ideas, so that when you look at the world and you act out the ideas, things go properly. And you can really facilitate that by writing. Writing gives you the chance to ask a question, to explore then the potential range of answers to that question. That's what you do when you're doing your, say, background research. And then you try to formulate an answer. But more than that, it also gives you a chance to observe what you've created, and then to organize it and edit it, and to iterate that. And so it enables you to reapply your cognitive capacity to the same problem over and over. I spent a lot of time writing. The first book I wrote, Maps of Meaning, very dense book. I didn't really write that for an audience, that book, which is a strange thing in some sense, because if you're writing a book, obviously, in principle, you want to communicate something, but I really wanted to understand something. That was the point there, was to solve a problem, and the audience, in some sense, was secondary to that. The later books I wrote, including the ones that many of you are familiar with, 12 Rules for Life and Beyond Order, were attempts, in some sense, to take what I had already walked through with my first book, Maps of Meaning, which I then lectured about for like 25 years, trying to compact it and reduce it to the gist. And those books were attempts to make that more communicable, And I was pushing my ability to think at the same time, so it wasn't just rote recitation of ideas I'd already developed, but the fact that I was able to derive those rules and then to communicate them more publicly was in no small part a consequence of having spent 3 hours a day for 15 years, pretty much rain or shine, writing, trying to think through a set of problems, partly trying to think through the nature of identity, I suppose, is one of the best ways of thinking about it. What does it mean to have an identity? Why do we cling to our identities? Why are they so important to us? How do they structure the way we look at the world? How do they regulate our emotions and our motivations? That's a really interesting question to me, because obviously they get committed to their beliefs, right? They'll kill for them or die for them. More likely the former, but often the latter. And it's very interesting to try to work through why beliefs, whatever they are, might be so important that you'll sacrifice everything to them. That's a very, very deep mystery, that. And so, anyways, it was as a consequence of many, many thousands of hours of writing, which is very much equivalent to thinking that I was able to derive the ideas that I was later able to publicize. And so this essay app that Tammy spoke of is an attempt to build the tools of production and editing into word processing technology. So far, people seem to think that it's quite useful. It took me a long time to formalize. When I was editing my students' papers, I was simultaneously trying to figure out what in the world I was doing when I was editing. You know, when you read something, it's not that easy to figure out how you evaluate it, right? We have some sense that some ideas are of higher quality than others, and that some ideas are deeper than others. But it's not exactly obvious what we mean by deeper or better, although there can be a fair bit of, what would you call it, consensus on that. It's not very easily formalized, and the problem is tied to the problem of perception itself. How do we understand a text, which is a very deep problem? And our culture is being torn apart, by the way, by debate about the issue of how it is that we interpret a text. So, for example, the postmodernist claim in some sense is that the texts that have guided our culture are, in some sense, nothing but the expression of the claims of power that have been made by one particular privileged group. That's what they are. And, you know, people do use their ideas to buttress their claims to power, and so it's not a critique without its merits, although there's a difference between saying that some ideas are used by some people some of the time to buttress inappropriate claims to power, and all ideas have that nature. Those are very different. Those are very different ideas. And I've been trying to work through what it is that what stories we do guide ourselves by when we're formulating our ideas and evaluating such things as quality and depth. If you're reading something, think, well, where's the meaning in the text? This is part of the problem the postmodernists posed as well. Where's the meaning in the text? People can differ in their interpretations of a text, and there's as many interpretations in some ways as there are people who are reading a text. And so since there's all those interpretations, how can you be sure that the text has any fixed meaning, or that it has any meaning at all, given all that variation in opinion? That's a very hard question. Now look, when you read text, when you think, where's the meaning? Well, it's to some degree it's in the letters, to some degree it's in the geometric shapes that make up the letters, because you couldn't infer the meaning of the letters without identifying the letters themselves, and you couldn't identify them without the geometric regularity of the shapes. But obviously the meaning of the text isn't embedded in the shape of the letters. It's not really embedded in the significance of any given word, although you're getting a little closer to meaning at the level of word than at the level of letter. But you do see the shapes and the letter and the word in some sense at the same time. But that isn't where it stops, because you see the word in relationship to the phrase, and then you interpret the phrase in relationship to the sentence, and then you interpret the sentence in relationship to the paragraph, and the paragraph in relationship to the chapter, and then the chapter in relationship to the book, and then the book in relationship to all the texts you've ever encountered, and in some sense all the ideas that you possess. And then all of that's nested inside a broader and embodied understanding of life itself. And when you process the meaning of a text, or even of any utterance, you're processing at every single one of those levels at the same time. It's unbelievably complicated. And when you're editing, you have to take all of those things into account simultaneously. And so I learned to formalize that to some degree. And when I gave my students feedback, I would comment on word choice and phrase quality and sentence structure and the ordering of the sentences within the paragraphs, and then the ordering of the paragraphs within the chapter. And then sometimes I'd have students who were pretty good at writing grammatically correct sentences and pretty good at structuring them in relationship to a given paragraph, but the whole essay felt flat. And that would be often because they were technically proficient but hadn't addressed an interesting idea and hadn't done it in a creative and exploratory manner. Then I'd have students who had the opposite problem. The whole bloody essay was a mess. Word choice was poor, the phraseology was unsophisticated, but there was something in the essay as a whole, so that there was an idea there. Those were often creative and intelligent people who were technically unskilled at writing, so that they had an intuition that had some accuracy and some grip, but they were very poor at delineating it. And so, you can make errors when you write and when you think at any single one of those levels, or at all of them. Very bad writers are doing so many things wrong that I often felt with some of the essays I was grading that it would be faster just to rewrite the whole essay than to grade it. There's so many, it's like, what did I do wrong? It's like, oh my God, the word choice is bad, the phrases are like cliched, the sentences are incoherent, you ordered them badly within the paragraphs sequencing has no narrative coherence, and the whole thing doesn't make any sense. It's like, that's what you did wrong. It's actually the impression you get from listening to a lot of political rhetoric, exactly the same thing. It's like, you're wrong at every single level of analysis possible, simultaneously. Yeah. That's quite the accomplishment. And then we enact those ideas in the world. And then I read today, this is real funny, my home province is Alberta. It's not funny at all, by the way. My home province is Alberta, and Alberta is the Texas of Canada. Though I think it's bigger, which is, haha, you Texans. It's not the biggest province in Canada either. In any case, Alberta has the 4th largest fossil fuel reserves in the world, and we have a diesel shortage. It's like, that's an impressive accomplishment. Man, to take that much plenty and turn it into want, that takes a particular kind of failure of political imagination at every possible level of conception simultaneously. So, and that's where we're at. Yeah. Well, you're all paying what, double the price for your fossil fuel that you were a year ago? Congratulations on that. That's a hell of a political accomplishment too. Right? Starving in the land of plenty. Very impressive. And so that's what happens when you can't think. And one of the things we were hoping with the essay app was that it would help people think, because when you can't think or don't, and then you act out bad ideas, then bad things happen. Which is why you think to begin with, right? You try to think things through so that good things happen and bad things don't. Bad ideas are bad because if you acted them out, you wouldn't get what you're aiming at. Or maybe bad ideas are bad because you're aiming at something bad and you have bad ideas and you act them out, and then you get the bad things you want. That doesn't make the ideas good. So the other thing I should tell you about that's on the front burner, some of you may know, and some of you don't, and some of you don't care. I joined forces with the Daily Wire a couple of months ago. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One reason is I'm an evil capitalist, and so are they, and so that means I can trust them because they're greedy in a predictable way, and that makes them real easy to deal with because they like money, and I like money, and so we've got an agreement there, and so I'd way rather be dealing with someone like that than someone who is making moral claims of a sort I don't understand. It's like, you like money, eh? Me too. We can probably move forward on that basis, and I don't have to figure that much out else. I don't have to figure out much else about you to get the ball rolling, right? It makes you trustworthy, and I know, and it's kind of a narrow sense in some sense, and I don't think that, it's that the aim of money should come above all other aims. I think that, first of all, I think that's foolish, and second of all, I don't think it works, but as an as a starting point, it's pretty good. And so they made me a good deal. But the deal was multi-dimensional because they basically offered me a situation where I could keep doing what I was doing, which I have kept doing, to put content out on YouTube, for example, but that I could also do a bunch of other things that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. And so that was a good deal, and I find them quite entertaining and enjoyable to work with. And so that's also a good deal. And so one of the things that we've done together, 2 months ago, I met a bunch of people in Miami. These were academics and scholars and intellectuals of various stripes, all of whom were super bright, at least in my estimation, and who had some literary knowledge. And so we got together and walked through the first half of the book of Exodus. And so some of you know that in 2017 I did a series of lectures on Genesis, and that was extremely useful to me, and hopefully the people who were watching and listening, and it's been very popular, strangely enough. And I wanted to continue my walk through the biblical narrative, I'd say story by story, and I was hoping to get to Exodus, and a variety of things occurred to make that not possible in the short term. But I brought 8 or 9 people, depending on the day, together in Miami, and the Daily Wire Plus people produced this, and we walked through the first half of the book of Exodus, 8 2-hour seminars. And so those will be released November 25th. And we're going to reconvene in January. Turned out I figured we could get through maybe we could get through the whole book in 8 or 9 days, but we only got through half of it. And the Daily Wire Plus people were, what would you call it? Flexible enough, and to double the shoot time. And so we'll finish it off in January. I'm very much looking forward to that. We've got a very good crew together to do that. So that'll come out November 25th. And I'll tell you just a little bit about it, to whet your appetite, let's say. But also because it's very useful to know. So one of the things that's really quite striking about the Exodus narrative is the juxtaposition of tyranny, slavery. There's 4 states of being that are laid out in the Exodus narrative. That's a good way of thinking about it. There's tyranny, right, and that's the pharaonic rule, and it's portrayed as tyranny. And interestingly, the tyranny is portrayed as undesirable. And you might say, well, that's self-evident. It's like, well, that is what tyrants think, right? Tyrants think that tyranny is good, and authoritarians think that authoritarian tyranny is good. And so the idea that tyranny in and of itself is undesirable at the level of the sacred, that's a very interesting metaphysical claim. And there's a corollary claim made simultaneously, which is that slavery is also wrong. And so those are 2 states of being, tyranny and slavery, and they're both regarded as inappropriate in the sight of God and unacceptable modes of human psychological and social interaction. And the story is predicated on that claim. And it's an axiomatic claim in a sense which is really a religious claim. It's set forward as a proposition that tyranny and slavery are both wrong. And God in that story is portrayed as the spirit that objects to both tyranny and slavery. And that's an interesting conceptualization of what God is or means. Because you have to ask yourself, if you believe, whatever that means, if you believe that tyranny and slavery are wrong, then you're an advocate of the spirit that objects to tyranny and slavery. Now, you might think, well, you might regard yourself, let's say, as a-religious, but if you object to tyranny and slavery, then you're possessed by the spirit that regards those states of being as unacceptable. And so that's a very interesting take on what constitutes belief. Because you can't really say it's your belief that tyranny and slavery is wrong, because if it was your belief, you'd believe it, no one else would. It's a collective belief. Now, not everyone shares it, and certainly not everyone throughout history has shared it, but it's not your idea. It's an idea that has you. And so then the question is, well, what's the nature of that idea, and where did it come from, and is it reliable, and all of that. And it's an animating idea. It's something you act out. So it's not just a statement about a set of facts. It's like if you regard tyranny and slavery as unacceptable, then that shapes the manner in which you see the world and the manner in which you act. It's not just an objective description of a set of patterns in the world. It's something like a personality that makes itself manifest within you. And that's very interesting to think about, very interesting to know. Those aren't the only states of being that are portrayed in the Exodus narrative. There's two others. They're less political or economic in some sense. There's the desert as a mode of being, and there's the promised land as a mode of being. And the promised land is something like the eternal destination. And I could say, and I think it's reasonable to say this, that if you're striving towards something, and if that striving grips you, right, renders you enthusiastic and motivated. Enthusiastic means to be inspired by the Spirit of God. Entheos is to be enthusiastic. And we tend to be enthusiastic in relationship to a goal we value. And you could think about the archetype of the valued goal as the image of the promised land. That's a good way of understanding it. And so whenever you're going somewhere that's better than where you are, which is what you're doing all the time when you're going anywhere, if you're going to be motivated, then in some sense what you're doing is moving forward to a partial You're moving forward. You're gripped by the apprehension that you're incrementally moving towards that which is most desirable. And that would be the ultimate destination point. That's another way of thinking about it. And it's an infinitely receding destination, right? Because you may move forward and accomplish a goal, but that doesn't stop you. It's a strange thing, because we often think we'll be happy when we reach our goal. It's like, that isn't how it works. Usually what happens when people reach a goal is that there is a moment of celebration, but there's an instant reconstitution of identity, right? Because on your graduation day from university, you're king of the undergraduates, and then the next day you're an unemployed person looking for a job at Starbucks. But you get my point, right? Is that when you hit the goal, then the entire structure that guided you toward that goal and that was part of your identity, it comes to an end. And then there's a period of confusion, an interregnum, you might say, which is the space between two kings. And there's disorientation there. And then another goal emerges, and perhaps it's a more comprehensive goal than the previous one, which would be a good thing. And so, in some sense, you're moving towards a goal, and then that completes itself, and then there's a collapse, and then you reconstitute another goal, and you do the same thing. That's Sisyphus, right? The man who rolls the rock up the hill only to have it roll back down. Sisyphus is often viewed as a narrative of ultimate pointlessness, but that's not the only interpretation of the stories. Well, if you got what you wanted, would you just stop? Like, is that the end? Are you done? Well, that doesn't work out very well, and so things have to be constituted so that you have a goal, and then you can attain it, but then a new goal makes itself manifest. And hopefully that's, especially if you've learned something and put yourself together in the pursuit of that previous goal, you're more together now, and there's more of you, and so the next goal, you could think of the next goal as a more sophisticated approximation of the promised land. And then you could think of that sequence of goals that makes up your life, if you're fortunate, as continual approximation towards the final destination. And then you get to have your cake and eat it too, in some sense, because you get to pursue proximal goals and attain them for whatever utility there is in that attainment, but you also get to continue the adventure. And it might be that it's the optimization of the continuation of the adventure that's the best goal. And that's a strange thing to think, but it's very useful. It's a very useful way to think, because then you don't stake your whole life on any given goal. Think, well, I'm optimizing my pursuit of a series of goals that transcend one another. And, when people ask questions like, well, what's the meaning of life? First of all, the meaning, but, there's many meanings of life. But this is a core meaning, this ability to optimize the process of goal construction and pursuit itself. And I would say, I really do believe this too, and we talk about this a lot, by the way, in the Exodus seminar, that the spirit of the logos, right? So logos is a very complicated idea. It's the word made flesh. That's one of the variants of the logos idea, which is like the embodiment of ideas, the word made flesh. And the logos is the spirit that allows you to confront the transforming horizon of the future and to transform it into the habitable order that is good. That's the logos as well. And the logos is the root word of logic, and the logos is also the comprehensible patterning of the world as such. It's all of those things. And that logos seems to be what manifests itself when you're gripped and motivated by the transformation of an ascending series of goals. That's Jacob's ladder, by the way. That's a very old vision, that idea of Jacob's ladder, the idea that there's a hierarchy that stretches all the way up to heaven and that is in constant correspondence with the earth. The shamanic vision is that ladder stretches out exactly to the North Star. That's a fixed point in the sky, right, that you can orient yourself by, because, of course, people navigate by the North Star. It's a fixed point in the heavens to orient yourself by. And Jacob's ladder stretches from Earth up to the North Star, and that's an imaginistic representation of this idea of a hierarchy of expanding goals. And partly what you're trying to do in your life is to envision yourself as the participant in a sequence of expanding goals. And then you get the advantage of having the goals, like I said, whatever proximal value there is in attaining the goal. But you get the adventure of the sequencing of the goals and the constant broadening that goes along with it. And that's real. That's real. It's not something merely metaphysical, although it's metaphysical too, because maybe you can imagine this. As your goal pursuit becomes more sophisticated, you're better for yourself. And yourself in an expanded sense. When you're young and you're impulsive, your goals are unsophisticated, and so you might optimize your emotion and your motivation, your resources in the short term, but fail in the medium to long term because you're not very sophisticated. But as you become more mature, you're more able to govern your behavior in the present so that what you do in the present works over a longer span of time, right? So you're not betraying yourself tomorrow by your actions today, which is like the definition of a kind of narcissistic impulsivity or hedonism, right? It's like, well, it's fun now. It's like, yeah, fair enough, but it's 3 a.m, and you're face down on the carpet, and that was fun, but there's tomorrow, and there you are tomorrow. And so in the pursuit of that short-term goal, you betray your future self, and as you become more mature, the harmony between your present self and your future self increases. That's a good way of thinking about it. And to some degree, you have to sacrifice the impulsive. You have to sacrifice the impulses of the present to ensure that harmony with your future self. That's a much more sophisticated idea of the self. You might say, well, it's okay to be out for yourself. It's like, well, what do you mean exactly? Do you mean your present hedonistic, impulsive, short-term self? Because that's a bad strategy. Do you mean yourself extended across time? That's a much wiser self. And that's actually the self whose care you promote when you socialize your children, because what you want your children to do is mature to the point where they can take care of themselves. And what that means is they're no longer acting in the short-term impulsive manner, but able to govern their conduct with reference to the fact that they're going to extend across time. And then you might say, well, the more mature you are, in the positive sense, the better you are able to bring your present self into harmony with all of the manifestations of your future self. And then you think, well, that's interesting, because what that does in some sense right away is turn you into a community, because you today and you tomorrow and you next week and you next month and maybe you in 20 years, or maybe you as a pensioner, if you're young, that's a lot of people to take care of across a long span of time. And it isn't obvious at all that that isn't the same as taking care of other people. I think it's the same thing. And so then you might say, well, as you get more sophisticated in your ability to build goals, and this is like a hierarchy of value, is one thing better than another? That's a perennial question. It's a question as perennial as is there meaning in life? And the answer seems to be something like, well, there is a hierarchy of value in goal pursuit, because the more sophisticated your goal is, the more contexts across which it works simultaneously. And that'd be true for you, because if you're taking care of yourself properly, that will work across time. And maybe it'll work across time in a way that makes things better and better across time, not only maintained. At least that would be the hope. And then you'd also hope that as you become more mature in your capacity to regulate yourself, that you would also simultaneously be able to bring more people under your umbrella of care. And so, and you can think about this in terms of contemplating what it is that you spontaneously admire about people. And this is assuming that you're not short-term psychopathic, hedonistic, and shallow. And I really mean that technically, because short-term impulsive, hedonistic, and shallow, psychopathic, narcissistic, that's all a technical diagnostic reference to a very short-term orientation. And why is that wrong? Well, the reason it's wrong, technically, is because it doesn't iterate very well. If you run that program repeatedly, it's going to drive you into the ground. And then if it's a really bad program of short-term impulsive, hedonistic, psychopathic self-gratification, it's not only going to run you into the ground, well, you get run into the ground, you're going to bring a bunch of other people with you. And unless you presume that being run nose first into the ground with a lot of other people is a good thing, then it's a bad thing, and that's why that's a bad identity. It can be a malevolent identity. It can not only be non-functional, it can be outright evil. And that's real. That's not just a matter of moral relativism. It's extraordinarily real. And the logos seems to be something like, imagine that, well, let's look at it this way to begin with. Imagine the people that you admire. We could start with people you don't admire. Generally, you don't admire people who could take care of themselves but don't. Now, that's a tricky judgment to make, because sometimes you see people who are ambivalently ill in multiple ways, and maybe they can't take care of themselves, right? It's even hard to apply that kind of discrimination to yourself when you're not well. It's like, well, are you ill or useless? And or are you ill or just using your hypothetical illness as an excuse? And people call themselves out on this all the time, and it's not always an easy distinction to make, but it's certainly the case that people can genuinely fail in that. This logos. So the people you don't admire, the people who could take care of themselves and don't. Here's another category. People you don't admire. People who could take care of other people, or people who could and should take care of other people, but who don't. Okay, you're not going to be gripped by admiration by those people. And that's interesting, right? Because admiration does grip you. If you admire someone, if you want to emulate them, because those are the same thing, if you want to mimic them, if you find them compelling, it's generally not because they don't take care of themselves, although they could, and they don't take care of other people, although they could. It's the opposite. And that's partly the intrinsic admiration for something approximating both competence and generosity. Right? You admire someone who is capable and who's generous. And the capability is something like the generation of whatever it is they're aiming at that's valuable. And then the generosity is the ability to distribute that. And then you could see that calls to you when you meet someone like that, or maybe even when you see yourself manifest the same spirit, you think, oh, that's good. And then that's a reasonable thing to conclude. And we're very confused about that in the modern world because we tend to be morally relativistic and think, well, what's good and not good, that's just an opinion. It's like, yeah, no. Really no. Because, and our nervous systems shout no. Because we're gripped with admiration, gripped by admiration in the face of some patterns of action and even by repugnance in the face of others. And so it's not so obvious at all that that's rationally thought through. It's not obvious at all that it doesn't reflect something fundamental about the nature of reality. And then this makes a certain amount of sense, right? You can imagine that it would be appropriate for you to be gripped by admiration for someone whom you see taking care of themselves in a very effective manner that works over the long run while they are walking uphill, and who's also able to do that for a bunch of other people at the same time. That seems like a good deal for everyone. And I would say, I really do believe that that's at the core of what we regard as celebration or worship. So admiration is like, it's like the entry level for worship. That's, you hear kids hero worship. What does that mean? Maybe they have a sports figure they admire. And admire means would like to imitate and are gripped by, right? Their attention is gripped by it. They want to emulate that. And the worship is the emulation of the highest possible spirit that instills admiration. That's a good technical definition of it. And then you might ask yourself, well, does that have any reality? And the answer is, well, are there patterns of behavior that iterate across time that lead uphill and that incorporate many people? And the answer is, well, obviously, because some people are more effective than others, and radically so, and that effectiveness is manifest in part in their charisma, I would say that's part of it, but in their reputation, and certainly in the proclivity of your own unconscious mind to grip you with admiration when you observe their actions. And that's a spirit calling to you. It really is that. It's a very good way of thinking about it. And that's the manifestation of the Logos. That's what that is. And that Logos is, part of what it is, seems to be something like the instinct for the spirit that iterates properly and productively across time to call to you to abide by its dictates or to follow its example. And that's a deep part of us. I don't know if there's a deeper part of us than that. You think about what happens when you, this is LA, this is a good place to talk about this. Think about what happens when you go to see a movie. A movie has a hero, or an anti-hero, and it doesn't matter, because the anti-hero just tells you how not to act, which is a good guide to how to act, because you just do the opposite, So it's the same thing. The story has to have a hero. The hero has to be compelling, and the compelling hero has to encounter true challenges and overcome them, and the overcoming has to be on an uphill trajectory, right? For it to be the kind of story that you would like to guide your life by. You don't want to act out a tragedy, not consciously. Yeah, well, you see people who have very tragic lives, and Carl Jung observed that they often unconsciously mimic a tragedy. Well, one of his injunctions was, you should figure out what myth is guiding you, because it might not be the one you would choose if you chose it consciously. And you have people around you, it's very common in life, and you see them striving mightily to aim down, and you think, what's going on? And the answer is, well, the wrong story has them in their grip. Now, I know people have catastrophic lives for reasons that are beyond their control as well. And that there's an element of blind chance in everyone's life. But you still know what I mean. And you see this in your own life, is that now and then you seem hell-bent on repeating the same foolish errors over and over. You ask yourself, well, why? It's like, that's a good question. Some stories got you in its grip, that's for sure. And it's not such a bad thing to try to make that conscious. It's hard, but not as hard as leaving it unconscious, that's for sure. And so, back to the Exodus story, talked about the promised land, right, as this, it's like a hyper goal. That's a good way of thinking about it. Or you could think of the promised land too as what all goals have in common. That's another way of thinking about it. So it's like the essence of the goal. And then it's portrayed in narrative, an image, as the shining city on the hill. That's an image, let's say, the heavenly city, the well-constituted house, the properly functioning country. These are all images of the same fundamental reality. That's the promised land, and that's what we're eternally striving toward. And I would say that's necessarily true because even the notion of striving is predicated on the fact that, on the reality that you're pursuing a goal that you find gripping, because otherwise you wouldn't be striving. It wouldn't be gripping if you didn't regard it as valuable. And then I would say, in the most fundamental analysis, it wouldn't be gripping and implementable if it wasn't a valid goal. It's like the definition of a valid goal. And so none of this is really metaphysical in any fundamental sense. It's really real as well as being metaphysical. So you have the promised land, and that's what calls to us. And the theory in Exodus is out of the tyranny toward the promised land. Right, so we have slavery and tyranny, both undesirable states. We have the promised land as a counterposition to that. But we also have an intervening problem, which is the desert. And this is something we explored to quite a great degree in this seminar. You might ask yourself, why are people willing to abide by the dictates of their own tyrannical conceptions? You could ask that of the inhabitants of a totalitarian state, obviously, because people tyrannize themselves in a totalitarian state. Their leaders have, but they're in on the game. And then you might ask that psychologically too. You may be clinging to presuppositions that you know aren't in your best interest, and you may be imposing those presuppositions on other people in a tyrannical way. And you might ask, well, if the alternative to the tyranny is the promised land, why in the world would you bother staying within the tyranny? And the answer is, well, what happens when you allow the tyranny to collapse? And the answer is, you don't end up in the promised land. You end up in the desert, right? And so that's another canonical place of being. Is the desert the Israelites found themselves lost in real? Well, they were lost for 40 years, and in that geographical neck of the woods, there isn't a desert large enough to wander around in for 40 years. And so unless you're walking in circles, and of course it could be, but there's an eternal desert that we all end up in from time to time, and you can spend a very long time there. And that place emerges when your tyrannical presuppositions are destroyed. And that's worth knowing too. It's worth knowing that a place like that exists, because if you end up there, at least you know where you are. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you know what to do, but at least you know that that's a category of human experience. And then to know that part of the reason that people will abide by the dictates of tyranny is because they're terrified of moving beyond the tyranny into the desert. That's really worth knowing too, right? Is that when you find out, this is the case, when you find out that you were wrong, that doesn't mean that now you know what's right. What it means is you know you were wrong, and that all falls apart. It's like, well, now what? It's like, now what? That's the desert. And so, one of the things we did discuss in the Exodus seminar is what should guide you in the desert. And Jonathan Pajos, whose work some of you know about, was instrumental in laying that out. I can't go into that tonight because it would take too long, but I can give you a bit of a hint about it. So, one of the things that happens in the desert, I can just give you a hint because I can't detail it out. Sorry. So in the Exodus story, the Spirit of God is the Spirit that calls the tyrant to justice. That's one way of thinking about it. But it also calls those who are enslaved to escape from tyranny. And so that means that spirit is neither the spirit of tyranny nor the spirit of slavery, but the spirit that extracts the human soul from those states. And you might ask, well, do you believe that that spirit exists? And the answer is, well, are you willing to move beyond tyranny and slavery towards whatever the alternative is? And if the answer is yes, then you believe in the existence of that spirit. If belief is what you then act out, which is a good definition of belief. When the Israelites are lost in the desert, they lose faith in the spirit that pulled them away from tyranny, and they don't know how to orient themselves in the desert. This is something else that's very relevant to today. And they start worshiping idols, which is what we do in the modern world when we become possessed by ideologies. It's exactly the same thing. Is that we've lost faith in the highest spirit, and that's fragmented, and the fragmentary pieces of that are then worshipped as ideologies. And then we're very badly disoriented. And I think the reason for that is that a belief system that isn't an ideology has this nature that I already described, which is that it concentrates on the description of the core pattern that enables you to constitute one goal after another in a manner that's sustainable across time, individually and socially, and in a manner that leads uphill. And that's a very tight set of constraints. There's not... The ability to do that is the ability to walk a very fine line. It's the line between chaos and order. That's a good way of thinking about it. That's a Taoist way of thinking about it. And the spirit that led the Israelites out of tyranny and slavery makes itself manifest again in the desert as the pillar of fire during the night and the pillar of cloud during the day. And so that's something like light in the darkness and darkness in the light. It's something like the harmonious play of opposites. It's something like the balance between chaos and order. And that's a very interesting thing to know. And I think so I guess I could explain it, turns out. And that's the same spirit that stacks these goals in the way that I just described. Why? Well, imagine that as your ability to apprehend the next goal expands, that's dependent on your ability to expand. You have to become wiser, right? Because if you're not wiser, then the next goal isn't going to be any more wise than the previous goal. And so the acquisition of wisdom is the precondition for the proper sequencing of expanding goals. That's a good way to think about it. Then you might ask yourself, well, how do you know when that spirit of wisdom is making itself manifest within you? And the answer would be something like, you're gripped by the experience. So imagine what we're doing in this silent lecture hall. You've got to ask yourself, why is it silent? And the answer is, because at the moment the words are landing. Right? And so everyone in the audience is sharing the same state of mind. It's partly why we like to do this kind of thing collectively. And the state of mind is the inhibition of all the other things your mind could be doing by whatever's going on right now. And the fact that whatever's going on right now is gripping is indicated by the fact that nothing's competing with it. And that actually works out neurologically, because you have a pattern of attention that's guiding your actions at the moment and your perceptions. And it's dominant enough, and I mean neurologically dominant, so that everything else stops. You're not moving around. You're not thinking about other things. It's inhibited everything else that could be happening. And then you might ask yourself, well, why would you allow yourself to have everything else that you could possibly be doing or thinking about come to a halt right now? And that's a value question. What makes what's happening right now more important than any of the other things that you could hypothetically be doing? And to some degree, you don't know the answer to that. But the answer manifests itself in something like, well, it's interesting. What's happening is interesting. And so then you might say, well, what does it mean for something to be interesting? Which in some sense is the same question as, what does it mean for something to be meaningful? And I would say, this is very cool, and I think it's true. If what's happening is putting you on the edge of chaos and order, so order is who you are, let's say, and chaos is the potential that's in front of you, and the being that you could become. You want to be on an edge, and the edge is the place where you're stable enough so you're not being fragmented, you're not afraid and overwhelmed, but you're not stagnant either, you're transforming. And let's say if it's optimally interesting, that's a signal that it's optimally transforming. And that's real, that signal. In fact, I think it is the most real thing. I really mean that. I mean that metaphysically, neurophysiologically, objectively. I think it's the most real thing, that instinct for being gripped by what transforms you optimally. And that's the play of opposites. It's the intermingling of what you know and what you don't know. It's the Taoist yin and yang, and it's also the interplay between the pillar of fire at night and the pillar of cloud during the day. It's the interplay of opposites. And so when you're lost, this is the message in some sense. When you're lost, well, what can you be guided by? And the answer would be, well, when you're lost, you can be guided by the spirit that compels your attention. It's the same as Moses attending to the burning bush, because it catches his attention and he attends to that. He allows that capturing of his attention to guide him, and that leads him towards divinity itself. And I think that's what the instinct for meaning does for us in some real sense, is that which grips us is a pointer to what would you say, the infinite source of redemptive revelation. I think that's literally the case. And that's also the Logos. And it's the spirit that if you follow that spirit, you become wiser. And as you become wiser, you can expand out your conception of the goal, and you can become more skilled at implementing that. And that's all real. And so that's part of what we discuss in this Exodus seminar. And so maybe you'll find it useful. And so with that, I'll turn my attention to the questions, and we'll continue with that.
Question one. What would you estimate are the boundaries between self-care and selfishness?
Well, that's a good follow-up question for what we've been discussing. Well, the first thing we have to sort out there is, well, what do you mean by self? And people make memes about me because I'm always asking for word definitions. But, and it annoys people because they think, well, it's just, you know what that means. It's like, is God real? What do you mean by real? Well, you can't ask that. It's like, well, then you can't ask your question either. What do you mean real? Well, everyone understands that. It's like, really, we do we? We understand what's real. We've got that nailed down. What you're really asking is something like, here's what I am insisting that you regard as real, which is usually something like an objective materialism. Does God fit into that category? It's like, well, that's a completely different question than the one you asked. No, perhaps, is the answer to that question, but you didn't formulate the question reasonably, because when you formulate a question like, is God real? God's a mystery in that question, and so is real. And you don't get away with the axiomatic presupposition that you've got real nailed down, and all we have to do now is mop up God. It's not reasonable. It's not acceptable in the least. It's just a trick. And it's not a very sophisticated trick. And so, in this situation, selfishness versus self-care. Well, I think really the issue there is the definition of self. So, whatever the self is very complicated. Because it's really what you are at your core. That's the question. That's unbelievably complicated. It's like, what the hell do you know about who you are at your core? I mean, human beings we have no idea what we are in the final analysis. And so, Carl Jung wrote books on the self. He believed Christ was a symbol of the self. It's a very complicated idea. It takes a lot of unpacking. You could think about the self as what it is that has demands right now. And when people attempt to define themselves subjectively, which has become something to be insisted upon in our current culture, they usually mean something like, the ultimate self is the whim that possesses me now. And that's a dubious proposition. What the whim that possesses you now is more accurately conceptualized as a fragmentary self. You know, if you have a 2-year-old and the 2-year-old wants something and has a little tantrum in the grocery store because of it, the impulsive demand that possesses that child in that context is a fragmentary part of the child, but it in no means is reflective of the totality of that person. Then you might ask yourself, well, what's the totality? And, well, as I said, that's a very complicated problem, but the totality of a person is certainly their iterations across time. It's at least that, right? Because there's a past you, and there's a present you, and there's a future you, and whatever you is in the final analysis is the aggregation of all of that across time. And maybe the aggregation of all of your manifestations in every social context as well. And then I could say, well, if you're taking care of yourself wisely, then you're taking all of that into account simultaneously. And then if that's selfishness, then that could be viewed as a positive good. But if you're subordinating that greater totality to the impulses of a momentary whim, which you've defined as the self, then that's a very bad idea. All that's going to do is cause trouble and make you unpopular. And so, I don't believe there's any difference between service to the highest self and service to other people. I think those are the same thing. Now, we can think about that technically too. So, there's a lot of other people, and there's only one of you. And you're going to interact with people in a multitude of ways across your life. And you could imagine this, is that if you play fair in every interaction, or if everyone you interact with walks away from your interactions having gained, then everyone is going to line up to play with you. And so, how is that going to be anything but good for you? How could anything possibly be better than that? Because you're outnumbered very badly. And so if all the people around you are inclined, because of the way you've conducted yourself, to facilitate your progress forward, why wouldn't that be the best thing for you that could possibly occur? And one of the things I've suggested to my audiences, and people seem to resonate with this quite deeply, is imagine yourself ill and bereft of capacity, suffering. You think, well, what might sustain you during such a time? This is the question that's posed in a marriage, for example, for better or for worse, let's say. And one answer is the fruits of the sacrifices that you offered in relationship to other people previously. And so what does that mean? Well, if you had been responsible and caring, mature, and self-sacrificing in the proper manner, and I don't mean martyrdom, like a nihilistic martyrdom or a resentful martyrdom, then you've stored up, to put it sort of coldly, social capital. And then people will be pleased to return the favor in times of desperation. And that way, if that was the case for all of us all of the time, then we'd be in a mutually sustaining web of interactions. And that's not exactly organizing your psyche, right, so that you can sail through suffering. It's more external. It's that you're storing up your sanity in the reciprocal goodwill that you've built up with other people. And to do that optimally, you do that in the spirit of something like playful love, if you do it optimally. And of course that's going to redound to your great benefit. But even better than that, it's going to redound to your great benefit in a way that's also simultaneously mutually beneficial to as many others as you're skillful enough to manage. And, you know, that's also a vision of paradise.
No. Take that out.
This developmental psychologist named Jean Piaget. Piaget is a very interesting thinker, and he was motivated by his life's goal was to reconcile science and religion. And modern analysts of Piaget generally regard him as a developmental psychologist, but he described himself as a genetic epistemologist. And by genetic, he meant one who analyzes the genesis of things or their beginning. And by epistemologist, he meant someone who analyzes structures of knowledge. And so what Piaget was trying to do was to understand how our structures of knowledge developed across time. He thought if you wanted to pursue philosophy, and even more deeply, let's say, theology, then it would make sense to look at how knowledge structures develop from childhood forward, because they're simpler in childhood and you might be able to understand them better than having to dive right into adult cognition. And he got a long ways on his enterprise. I think farther than people realize. He's a very sophisticated thinker, and he had this theory of equilibration, which is a lovely theory. So an equilibrated system will maintain itself without outside compulsion. And you might think, well, that's what you want in a political system, right? Because you want to live in a state that you want to live in. And you all, in fact, live in a state, I don't mean California, I mean the United States. And California less so lately, by the way. You want to live in a state where you don't have to be compelled. You want to be part of an organization that you've bought into voluntarily. And it's so interesting, because that's actually one of the criteria by which you could judge the value of a state. Does the state have to impose its dictates by force? Or does the state offer you a vision that you voluntarily accept and celebrate? And I would say your country has been very, very good at that. I mean, the American dream is not a dream that merely possesses Americans. Right? It's a dream that, in some sense, has been offered to the whole world. And I would say you might ask, well, what's the evidence for that? And I would say, how about the fact that people want to move here? That constitutes the evidence. And even though this country is far from perfect, that's not exactly the issue. The issue is it less imperfect than the other offerings? And the answer to that is, well, do people want to move here? And if the answer to that is yes, then that's the evidence. Clearly they want to move here, and there are reasons for that. And the reason for that in some sense is because you're playing an equilibrated game. It's a game that will sustain itself without compulsion. And that's actually the definition of a game. So for Piaget, a game was a microcosm of the promised land. That's a good way of thinking about it, if you want to think about it theologically. So a game is an arrangement of vision shared by two or more players voluntarily. And so when two children decide to play a game together, maybe they decide to play house, the one child who's offering the game might say, do you want to play house? And the other child, say it's a boy and a girl, say, yeah, I'd like to play house with you. And so then no force is required because both are voluntary participants. And then the children develop a shared vision, which is the confines of the game, play house. Then they run the simulation, and if they run the simulation properly, then they both find it engaging, and the engagement is a marker for the quality of the game, and the game expands their capacity to perceive and act with skill in relationship to an important life goal, right? Establishing a permanent relationship, because that's what you're practicing when you're playing house. And if that's done optimally, then it doesn't require compulsion. And if the two children are very good at doing that together, then they want to repeat it and continue to develop their skill, and that's what a friendship is. And that's not based on power, right? That's not based on a power relationship. That's so cool to know that, because, you know, the cynics say, well, it's all about power. And they usually say that because they want it to be all about power. But really, but that isn't the basis for stable human relations. Stable human relations are based on the construction of equilibrated states. And if your marriage is equilibrated, you both want to be in it. Now, I mean, there'll be times when you don't, and, you know, you need to abide by the fact that you've accepted some constraints so that while you're not equilibrated, you're not getting along, you don't just leave, right? You still fight it through and try to reestablish an equilibrated state. But the idea of equilibrated state is extraordinarily interesting, and it's a vision of paradise. And the proper vision of paradise is something like eternal play. That's a good way of thinking about it. And play is a better basis for the establishment of social relations than power, by any measure, by any multitude of measures. And so, properly selfish is an equilibrated state across multiple instantiations of games, across a very long period of time, in very many social contexts. And so, if you're serving that, that's enlightened selfishness, you could say. But it's identical with treating other people in the best possible manner. It's the same thing. And we know that, you know, we have an ethos. Our culture is predicated on ethos, which is treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated yourself, or maybe more, love thy neighbor as thyself. And that means to act towards your neighbor as if he or she is capable of producing a sequence of Jacob's ladder-like goals across time, and that you're of the same nature, and that will increase the probability that that direction will be the one that makes itself manifest. And that's definitely the case. I mean, I had people in my clinical practice who had become embittered and resentful. They're often naive people, and people generally start out naive, who'd been betrayed. You know, and they regarded their loss of naivety as an increment in wisdom. And you see this with cynical people, right? And they think, well, I was naive and I got burned, and that's not going to happen again. It's like, fair enough, that actually is an increment in wisdom, but you're in the desert at that point, right? I mean, the naivety wasn't a virtue, and the collapse is a catastrophe, but the place you end up with is not positive. But you're not going to say, well, I'm not going to drop my cynicism and go back to being naive, because that would actually be a reversal of the acquisition of knowledge. Plus, you know, what they say, once burned, twice shy. So then, well, what's the alternative to the cynicism that's induced by malevolence? And the answer to that is something like, it's something like courageous trust. So imagine that you want to bring the best out of people, even though now you know that there's plenty of the worst there too. And the answer is, well, the question is, how do you do that? And the answer doesn't seem to be by facing everyone with a pervading spirit of distrust and bitterness. That just doesn't seem to work. And you might think, well, that's justified because I've been burned multiple times. Why wouldn't I do that? And the answer has to be something like, because you have the courage not to. Right? If you're not going to fall back into a foolish naivety and not allow yourself to be twisted into nihilism by bitterness, then your option is something like, well, I know perfectly well that you're full of snakes, but I'm going to extend my hand anyway, based on the faith that if you have the courage to do that, that the being that you will call out of the other person is thereby rendered most likely to be of the upward stumbling type. And I think that's the case. You see people who are very sophisticated in their perceptions and social ability, and they can interact even with people who are quite corrupt and still increase the probability quite dramatically that the interaction will be positive. And that's part of that impulse towards the development of an equilibrated state. And so, to reach out your hand like that to your fallen brother, let's say, without being naive, that's part and parcel of acting out that highest order conception of the self. That's the logos. That's how that works. So that's an answer to that question. Well, I'll tell you about this suit because it's quite fun. So, I was approached by this very creative clothier. They are, I'm not going to go any farther. LGFG Fashion House. They contacted me 3 months ago, and said they wanted to make me 12 suits, one for each of the rules of my first book. And so that was fun. How many of you know who the Trailer Park Boys are? They're terrible. They're terrible people. Anyways, one of the suits has a Trailer Park Boys lining. That's very funny. And another one has a lining with Jung and Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and George Orwell and Viktor Frankl. So that's very cool. And this suit, this is sheep wool on this side, and goat's wool on this side. And that's heaven. So, the tie as well. So I have blue trousers as well, depending on whether I'm feeling like raising hell or walking towards heaven. So, yeah, they made me these remarkable suits. They're crazy, they're over-the-top suits. I have one, I just got a picture of the boots sent tonight. They're kind of elf boots, which is strange. And they're green. And it's a tuxedo for this suit, what I'm speaking of. It's green tuxedo, and it's impregnated with crushed jade. And so sparkles away, just quite preposterous, extremely entertaining, as is this suit. So that's the story of the suits. I could tell you a little corollary to that, I suppose. So when I first went on tour in 2018, I thought about how I was going to dress, because I thought about everything I could think about before I went on tour. I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go all in every way I could. Like, I was going to do it halfway. So I thought, well, I better pay some attention to how I dress. I'd always dressed fairly formally as a university professor. My father was a school teacher, and he always dressed in a suit, even in the 70s when that became unfashionable. And I asked him when I was a kid, one day, I asked him why, because most of the other teachers had stopped doing that, and he said it was to show respect for his students. And he meant it. And my father's a credible person, so when he says that sort of thing, it's worth taking it seriously. And when I became a graduate student, I tended to dress relatively formally, partly to distinguish myself from the undergraduates who were pretty much my age. It was, a way of establishing a bit of a boundary of authority, let's say. And then when I started to teach at Harvard, I wore suits all the time, and at the University of Toronto. And when I went on tour, I bought some very nice suits, and I spent a lot of money on them, which was very hard on me, because I wasn't sure it was appropriate. But as I said, I decided I was going to go all in. And one of the things that's been very cool about that, and I didn't expect it at all, and it's a good example of how going all in produces benefits you might not expect. As I've traveled all around the world, an increasing proportion of my audience, and so now many of you are going to be embarrassed because you didn't do this, but an increasing number of the people in the audience dress formally. Lots of the people I meet about 150 people after each of these shows on stage, and a large proportion of them come in suits, and many of them have told me that it was the first suit they ever bought. And so it's so cool to see that. Like, I don't like seeing adult men dressed like hyperinflated 10-year-olds. I don't think it's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing for adults to mimic teenagers. And so it's a good thing to see people look like adults and to try to be adults, because it's actually better to be an adult than a child. Though a playful adult that's a good goal, Then you get the best of both worlds. But anyways, I bought a variety of suits, and that seemed to work out pretty well. And I think that was one of the inspirations for the offer of the people who made these suits. And so that's just been, it's just been fun. I didn't expect it at all. I certainly didn't expect the suits that I got delivered. It's quite, I don't know. They made them, I'm wearing them. That's how it works out. So that's the answer to that question. Yeah.
Conservatives keep losing. The left controls media, universities, and government. How can conservatives be effective, and how can they win?
They have to tell a better story. Fundamentally, that's it. And then I think not only do they have to tell a better story, they have to act out a better story. That's the same with religious believers. It's like, you want your God to win? It's like, get your act together, right? Be a shining light on the hill for your faith. And then that's how you win, and we shouldn't even be thinking about winning in some real sense. We should be thinking about how to make things better. And so the conservative question is, how could we be more effective at making things better than those who don't abide by the traditions we regard as valuable? And that's a real question. It's very, very difficult to sort that out. One of the things, I didn't know that I was a conservative before everybody started telling me that I was, but
Apparently I am. So, and one of the benefits of that is that there are conservative stories that are quite compelling, and they haven't been told well for quite a long time. And one of maybe the core story that's compelling on the conservative side is something like that meaning and responsibility are integrity linked. And that's not a story that's been well told in our culture for at least since the mid-60s. It's just not told at all. And I've noticed that story has a universal impact on the audiences that I've been addressing. To walk people through the notion, for example, that if you find yourself in dire straits at some point in your life, that one of the arcs that you might have managed to build yourself will be constructed of the social relations made possible by the people for whom you took responsibility. And everyone understands that as soon as you lay it out. It's like, well, of course that's going to be the case, obviously. If you have been a credit, if you have conducted yourself credibly in the eyes of the people you've interacted with, the probability that they're going to be hungry for the opportunity to reciprocate is very, very high. And so one core conservative message is something like meaning through responsibility. And that's a very, very deep message. I mean, that's the idea of bearing your cross. It's the same idea. It's the deeper the responsibility, the more radical the meaning. Radical in terms of its capacity to transform and sustain. And I think that's just true. Sort of, it's as soon as you think it through, you understand it's true. And it's quite the crazy idea, that your life would deepen and broaden in precise proportion to the degree that you were willing to take radical responsibility. And that's something you can experiment with, and that's a message conservatives could and should deliver, but also, more importantly, act out. That's the fundamental issue, is the acting out. And I think that young people they're literally dying for that message, because we are in a meaning crisis in some real sense. Cataclysmic consequence of the death of God, let's say. What should orient you in life? Well, certainly the willingness to dare to accept radical responsibility. That's a good answer to the question of how do you find meaning in life. You could try just doing the best you possibly can for other people. And I don't mean in a sense of bitter self-immolation. That's not going to sustain itself. It's not a good strategy. Like, you could just try that and see what happens. You kind of know what's going to happen, because there'll be people who take advantage of you. But they even might learn with time. Anyone capable of shame is certainly going to be shamed by the realization that they've betrayed someone who's been good to them, insofar as they have any capacity for shame whatsoever. Even the worst of people can find a pathway to redemption through that kind of shame, but that won't even emerge unless there's been someone who was good to them that they could betray. You know, and one of the things that struck me from reading Carl Jung, again, Swiss psychoanalyst who was a stunning genius, he believed that he was very obsessed with what had happened in Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s, and then also with the emergence of the potential for nuclear annihilation after the Second World War. And his hypothesis was something like, we have to become as good as we are technologically powerful. And right now we're more technologically powerful than we are good. And
He believed that was in part because our technological enterprise had expanded in some sense exponentially since the dawn of the scientific revolution, but that our ethical wisdom had stagnated, or, well, stagnated is good enough, and that's not acceptable, because as you become more powerful, you better become better, because otherwise that power will, your foolishness will, you'll be unable to control the power that you've developed, and it will turn against you as a consequence of your own sin. That's a perfectly good way of thinking about it. And so that struck me as highly credible, especially after I'd read a lot about totalitarian states and the fact that the reason totalitarian states can maintain themselves, so that would be definitely the use of power against, our own power against ourselves, a totalitarian state. The reason those states sustain themselves is because every individual in those states lies about everything all the time. So it's a direct consequence of individual sin. Now that's not all it is, but that's a lot of what it is, that's for sure. And so I felt that the pathway forward into a world of unlimited human technological ability was through the radical renovation of the individual psyche, as radical a renovation as the technological renovation itself. And we're playing that out now. We're going to find out, probably in the course of most of our lifetimes, whether or not we can manage that. And we're pretty technologically powerful, and we're getting more technologically powerful all the time, and very, very quickly. And so that means we better get better fast at the same time. And yeah, and the hardening thing, I would say, the hardening thing in that is that, you know, that's not a matter of just constraining yourself, because people think, well, you know, how dull it is to be good. There's all these things that I would like to do that I no longer can. It's all constraint and walls. It's all regulations and rules. And conservatives can come across as people who promote that viewpoint. It's all about constraint. But that's not right, because there isn't anything more adventurous than being good, and there isn't anything better than adventure. And you might say, well, why is being good an adventure? And one of the answers to that is, well, it's really difficult. And so that's a plus. It's difficult in a voluntary sort of way. It means you have to take yourself in hand, right? And that's a challenge. But maybe you want a challenge. It seems that you want a challenge. And you might say, you might observe that part of being good is saying what you believe to be true. You might say, well, why is that an adventure? And the answer is, well, you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth, right? Whatever happens when you tell the truth is whatever's going to happen when you tell the truth. You have to let go of the outcome. You have to, it's an act of faith. You have to presume, if you're going to tell the truth, this is a very strange thing. If you're going to tell the truth, you have to presume axiomatically that whatever happens when you tell the truth is the best thing that could have possibly happened. Sort of regardless of what happens. And because sometimes you get in trouble for telling the truth. In fact, that's why children lie, right? Almost always. They lie because they don't want to get in trouble. And then you might say to them, well, they might object, well, why shouldn't I lie? Because I just get in trouble if I told the truth. It's like, well, the answer is because you'll get in a lot more trouble if you lie. It'll just take a lot longer to manifest itself. But when it does, it'll be way worse. And so you might as well take your lumps while the hand that's delivering the blow is still relatively mild, rather than store it up and wait for the crushing blow that will definitely come for you if you stack up enough lies. And so you tell the truth because you presume that whatever manifests itself as a consequence of the truth is the habitable order that is good. That's also an axiom of the belief in the Logos, is that truth sets you free. And the alternative to believing that is to believe that falsehood sets you free. It's like, fine, you know,
Try it out. Well, what we saw in the 20th century is that if falsehood rules, then you have a totalitarian state. That's the definition of a totalitarian state. Everyone lies about everything to everyone all the time. And that's hell. And you might say, well, I don't believe in hell. It's like, well, have it your way. Visit North Korea and see if it's real. It's real enough. And you might say, well, it's not eternal. It's like, well, you feel like it was if you lived there. So, and I'm not so sure it's not eternal in some more fundamental sense as well, because it's always a place we could go. And it's always there as a possibility. So, and I don't know what that means in the final analysis, but I know what it means practically and politically, in a tangible sense. So, one more.
What's your favorite cut of beef? That was your number one question.
You're a deep group, you Californians. Philadelphia charred New York stripped. That's not aged. We can answer.
Okay. We'll see what the question is that's number one then. What advice can you give to current college students who attend a university that is hostile to conservatives and even classical liberal values?
Well, you have the library. So when I went to university, it was still the case that mostly you had to educate yourself. Like you could find some professors who were worthy of attention, and you could get them to guide you through your learning, but you had to do the learning, you had to read the books, and in some sense, regardless of how woke your particular college might be, you still have the library. You can read great books. So far that's not illegal. So that's good. And you can find out what those great books are by asking your professors. They're not all going to be woke, but if that doesn't work, it's not that difficult to find what the great books are by doing some investigations online. And so don't despair. You're still a student. You still have those 8 hours a day that you could spend reading and thinking. And then you can also take the opportunity to learn how to defend yourself. There is some utility in being surrounded by those who are antagonistic to your intuitions, because the fact of their opposition can sharpen you. And so, as long as you take the opportunity not to falsify your vision. Students sometimes will say, well, I need to get a grade, and I'll just tell the professor what he or she wants to hear. It's like, you should never do that. That's a very bad idea. You should never do that at work. So I'll tell you a psychological experiment that's worth knowing about. So imagine that you bring a bunch of people into a lab, and you give them a questionnaire about their views on immigration, and then you rank them from pro to anti-immigration. I'm just taking a simple example. And then you take those who classify themselves as anti-immigrant, and you get them to write like 700 words about why immigration is good. And then you take the pro-immigrant types and you ask them to write a 700-word essay about why immigration is bad. And then you get them to come back a week later, and you give them the same attitude questionnaire. And what you find is that those who wrote the counter-attitudinal essay have shifted their political views dramatically in that direction. And so what does that imply? Well, on the positive side, if you're taking a viewpoint different than your own voluntarily, and you're doing that as a matter of exploration, then it's going to differentiate and make more sophisticated your political vision, because you'll be able to take a look at an issue from more viewpoints simultaneously. But if you're doing it manipulatively, let's say, to get a grade, you're going to write out false beliefs, and then you're going to believe them. And so, if you practice doing that for 4 years, then you're going to be the acolyte of the beliefs that you deceived yourself into supporting. Now, the alternative is to believe that you're wise enough to detail out explicit arguments that you don't agree with, and to ignore that, and to wall yourself off from that, and to not have it affect you at the same time that you're maintaining your original beliefs. You can just forget that. You just do not have the capacity to do that. If you deceive other people habitually, you will corrupt your own vision. And that's a very bad idea. And, there's a sin in the Gospels, the sin against the Holy Ghost, which cannot be forgiven. And the nature of that sin has been debated forever, let's say. But I think that's what it is. It can't be forgiven. If you corrupt your own vision, the reason that can't be forgiven is because you've corrupted the very thing that could redeem you. You've interfered with the very process that would orient you, that would reorient you in the world. They say there's none so blind as those who will not see. If you obscure your own vision, then how will you not fall into a pit? So if you're in a university that's ideologically corrupt, you have an opportunity to defend yourself. You have an opportunity to make yourself sharp. You still have an opportunity to learn. And then you have an opportunity to pit yourself against those who would deny your vision. And you can really become educated if you manage that. Now, that's very difficult. I'm not claiming for a moment that that's easy. And I would say the other thing that you want to do is you want to surround yourself with people. You need a community to help you take that on. But the probability is pretty high that if you're sitting in a class and it's hyper woke and you have an objection, that a good proportion of the people in that class have the same objection. In fact, perhaps the majority, even though they might be too timid to make that objection known because they're afraid of the tender mercies of the woke mob. And there's real reasons to be concerned about such things. But there are real reasons to be concerned about the alternative. I don't want to be mobbed, therefore I will falsify my speech. It's fair enough. I can understand why you don't want to be mobbed, because that is definitely not pleasant. It's equivalent to, it's a real blow to be mobbed. It's really, really hard on people. It's really, really hard on people. And so I understand why people are afraid of that. The problem is they're not afraid enough of the alternative. If you kowtow to the tyrannical mob, you are now a slave. And if you practice being a slave, that's what you'll be. And if you practice being a slave, you will deliver the power that you would have had to the tyrants. And it's way more wise to be more afraid of that than to be afraid of being mobbed. Because that's really not a good outcome. And you wonder, what happens in these states that have gone so terribly wrong. Why did Nazi Germany deteriorate the way it did? Why did Russia and China deteriorate the way they did? And the answer is, well, people kowtowed to the tyrant until everyone was a tyrant and a slave simultaneously. There's the definition of a totalitarian state. You're a slave and a tyrant at the same time. You're your
you're your own tyrant's slave. What a lovely situation to be in. It's hell, and you're the ruling devil. And you live there. What a deal. That's a totalitarian state. And so, if you're in a woke university, don't falsify your words. That's the worst thing you can do as a student. It's the worst thing you can do in your life. There's a reason we believe in our culture that the word is divine. The word shapes the world. You falsify your relationship to your words at the peril of your soul. And you might say, well, what does that mean? I don't believe in the soul. It's like, that's really beside the point in some fundamental sense. There are worse things than death. If you don't know that, you're fortunate, I suppose. The corruption of the soul is worse than death. And you corrupt your soul by falsifying your words. And so when you go to university, woke or not, do not let the tyrant take away your tongue. And striving to determine how that might be forestalled, that will be your education. So, and that's a good place to end.